The crystal spires of the royal palace on Sixterra sparkled under the light of 3 moons, but Queen Corilla couldn't bring herself to look at her reflection in them. Unlike the rest of her species, whose scales shimmered like precious gems and whose bodies moved with flowing grace, Corilla was different. Her scales were dark and rough, resembling ancient volcanic rock rather than precious stones. "Your Majesty," a servant spoke from behind her, voice trembling. "The High Council requests your presence." Corilla turned, watching the servant flinch at her appearance. Her asymmetrical features, with one eye slightly larger than the other and facial ridges that didn't align perfectly, made even her own people uncomfortable. "Tell them I will arise shortly," she replied, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. The Grand Council chamber was a marvel of crystalline architecture, with walls that seemed to sing when the wind blew through hidden channels. 12 council members sat in their elevated seats, all of them displaying the perfect beauty that Sixterrans prized so highly. Their scales rippled with colors that would make Earth's most precious opals seem dull in comparison. "Queen Corilla," spoke High Counselor Zixna, her perfect features twisted in barely hidden disgust. "We have gathered to discuss a matter of grave importance to our people." Corilla stood tall, despite feeling the weight of their judging stares. "What concerns trouble the council?" "You do, Your Majesty," another council member spoke. "Your appearance is causing unrest among our people. The ancient texts speak of the ruler of Sixterra being the embodiment of perfect beauty. You," he paused, searching for diplomatic words, "do not meet these requirements." Corilla's heart sank, but her voice remained steady. "The ancient texts also speak of wisdom, justice, and diplomatic skill. I have doubled our trade routes, established peace with 3 neighboring systems, and improved the living conditions of our people." "Achievement without beauty is like a crystal without light," Zixna countered. "Our people look to their ruler for inspiration, for an ideal to aspire to. Instead, they see." She gestured vaguely at Corilla's form. The council chamber erupted in murmurs of agreement. Corilla stood alone in the center, her rough scales absorbing rather than reflecting the ambient light, making her appear like a dark statue among the glittering counselors. "We have drafted a decree," Zixna continued, producing a crystal tablet. "You will be provided with a comfortable exile on one of our outer colonies. Your cousin, Zixrel, whose beauty is without question, will assume the throne." Gorilla's claws dug into her palms. "You would dismiss years of successful rule because of appearance." "We would maintain the very foundation of our society," Zixna corrected. "Beauty is order. Beauty is strength. Beauty is everything." As Corilla looked around the chamber, she saw no allies among the glittering faces. The council had made their decision long before this meeting. Her achievements meant nothing compared to her failure to meet their standards of beauty. Little did they know that their decision would set in motion events that would change their civilization forever, starting with the arrival of a species that saw beauty in very different ways. James Chen stepped off the Earth diplomatic vessel onto the crystalline surface of Sixterra's spaceport, adjusting his collar in the planet's warmer atmosphere. As Earth's chief negotiator, he had handled dozens of first contact situations, but the beauty of this world still took his breath away. Everything sparkled, from the buildings to the very ground beneath his feet. "Welcome to Sixterra, Earth Diplomat Chen." A melodious voice greeted him. A tall, iridescent being stood before him, her scales shifting colors like the surface of a soap bubble. "I am Zixna, High Counselor. We have prepared extensively for your arrival." James bowed respectfully, following the briefing protocols. "The honor is mine, High Counselor. Earth looks forward to establishing strong trade relations with your people." As they walked through the capital city, James couldn't help but notice how every Sixterran they passed seemed to shimmer with perfect beauty. Yet something felt off about their society. Too perfect, too uniform. During the first diplomatic meeting, James sat quietly, observing. The council members discussed trade routes and resources, their movements graceful and practiced. But it was a voice from the shadows that caught his attention. Deeper, more thoughtful, offering insights about Earth's trading patterns that even he hadn't considered. Who was that? He asked during a break, pointing to the darker corner of the chamber where the voice had come from. Zixna's face showed a flash of dismay. No one of consequence, Diplomat Chen. Merely a former advisory member. But James wasn't convinced. During the next session, he deliberately positioned himself to see into the shadows. There she sat, different from the others, with dark, rough scales and asymmetrical features. Yet her eyes held an intelligence that outshone the glittering beauty around her. When she spoke again about the potential benefits of combining Earth's technological advances with Zixteran crystal engineering, James watched in fascination. The council members shifted uncomfortably, trying to talk over her, but her points were brilliant. After the session, James lingered behind, pretending to study some architectural details. The dark-scaled Zixteran tried to slip away, but he called out, "Your analysis of Earth's tech integration possibilities was exceptional." She froze, turning slowly. You're speaking to me." "Of course. I'm James Chen." He approached, noting how she seemed to brace herself for the usual reaction to her appearance. "I'd love to hear more about your ideas for cultural exchange programs between our worlds." For the first time, Kurilla met someone who looked at her and saw not an ugly outcast, but a mind worth listening to. "I am Kurilla," she said softly, "though most prefer to pretend I don't exist." "Their loss," James replied with a genuine smile. "Would you be willing to discuss your insights over dinner? I find the official meetings a bit restrictive." Kurilla glanced around nervously, then nodded. "There's a private chamber in the East Wing. Few go there because the crystals are imperfect." "Perfect," James said, not missing the irony. Sometimes the most interesting conversations happen in imperfect places. The dimly lit crystal chamber cast strange shadows as Kurilla shared ancient scrolls with James, their heads bent together over historical documents. For the past week, they had been meeting secretly, away from the judging eyes of the High Council. "These trading patterns," Kurilla explained, pointing to complex crystal formations that served as Zixteran records, "show how our ancestors dealt with the Centaurian Empire. The Council is making the same mistakes now with Earth." James nodded, fascinated both by the information and how Kurilla's dark scales absorbed and reflected light differently from other Zixterans. "They're so focused on appearing perfect that they're missing genuine opportunities for both our worlds." Their discussion was interrupted by hurried footsteps. Kurilla quickly gathered the scrolls, moving to hide in a shadowy alcove, a practiced motion that made James's heart ache. High Counselor Zixna burst in, flanked by 2 guards. "Diplomat Chen, what are you doing in this unsuitable area?" "Research," James replied calmly, gesturing to the crystal formations. "Your architecture is fascinating." Zixna's perfect features twisted with suspicion. "You shouldn't be here. We have prepared proper meeting rooms for Earth's delegation, ones that better represent our civilization's beauty." "Beauty comes in many forms," James said carefully. "On Earth, we find value in contrast and imperfection. Some of our most prized artworks are deliberately asymmetrical." "How primitive," Zixna said with barely concealed disgust. "Please, allow us to escort you to more appropriate chambers." And her voice hardened. "Kurilla, you can stop hiding. Your dark scales don't hide you as well as you think." Kurilla emerged, head held high despite the guard's sneers. "I was sharing our history with Diplomat Chen, knowledge that could benefit both our peoples." "You were not authorized to speak with Earth's delegation," Zixna snapped. "Your exile decree is being processed. Until then, you will remain in your quarters." James stepped forward. "Excuse me, but as Earth's representative, I believe I have the right to speak with any Zixteran official who might help our negotiations succeed." "Kurilla is no official," Zixna said coldly. "She is an embarrassment we have tolerated for too long." Guards, Escort her to her quarters. Diplomat Chen, please come with me. We have much more suitable company for you. As the guards moved toward Kurilla, James noticed her slip something into his pocket, a small crystal containing what looked like ancient records. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a slight nod. Whatever the council was hiding, he would find out. The guards led Kurilla away, but not before James saw the determination in her eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Late that night, James sat in his quarters, examining the crystal Kurilla had slipped him. When held up to light, it projected ancient Zixteran text onto the wall. What he read made his eyes widen with each passing minute. The original queens, he muttered, taking notes. They were all like her. A soft knock interrupted his research. Using the secret signal they'd established, Kurilla entered through a hidden service corridor. Her dark scales seemed to absorb the moonlight streaming through the windows. "Did you read it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, your ancestors, the warrior queens who united this world. They all had dark scales like yours. It wasn't considered ugly then. It was a mark of strength." Kurilla moved to the window, staring at her reflection. "The council rewrote our history. They claimed beauty was always our way, that the perfect crystalline form was our natural state. But it's all a lie." James stood beside her. "On Earth, we have something called the peacock's tail. Beautiful, but impractical. Your dark scales." He reached out, hesitated, then touched her arm gently when she nodded permission. "They're stronger than the iridescent ones, aren't they?" "Yes," Kurilla said. "They can withstand extreme temperatures, protect against radiation. The decorative scales the council prizes so much would shatter under such conditions. Our ancestors were explorers, warriors, survivors. Not just pretty ornaments," James added, understanding dawning in his eyes. Kurilla turned to him suddenly. "Why don't you flinch when you look at me?" "Everyone else does." James smiled. "On Earth, we have a saying. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We find beauty in strength, in character, in the unique. When I look at you, I see someone who carries herself with dignity despite rejection, who thinks deeply about her people's welfare even when they shun her." For the first time in her life, Kurilla felt tears forming in her eyes. The council will never accept this truth. They've spent generations building their perfect society. "Then maybe it's time for an imperfect revolution," James said, his hand still on her arm. "Your people deserve to know their true history, and you deserve to be seen for who you really are." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, something that went beyond diplomacy, beyond cultural exchange. In that moment, they were just two beings who saw the truth in each other, imperfections and all. "We'll need a plan," Kurilla said, new determination in her voice. "We have one," James replied, tapping the crystal. "The truth." The Grand Council chamber buzzed with tension as all of Zixtera's noble houses gathered for Kurilla's exile ceremony. High Counselor Zixna stood at the center platform, her scales gleaming with artificial perfection. "Today we cleanse our society of an imperfection that has troubled us far too long," Zixna announced, her voice echoing through the crystal chamber. "Kurilla, step forward to accept your exile." Kurilla walked proudly to the platform, her dark scales a stark contrast against the shimmering walls. James stood among the Earth delegation, holding the ancient crystal tight in his pocket. "Before this proceeding continues," James called out, stepping forward, "Earth would like to present something of historical significance." Zixna's perfect features twisted with annoyance. "This is an internal matter, Diplomat Chen. Your interference is not welcome. As your potential trading partner, we believe this directly affects our negotiations," James replied firmly. He pulled out the crystal and placed it in the central reader. Ancient images flickered across the chamber walls. Gasps filled the room as images of the ancient warrior queens appeared, all bearing dark, rough scales like Kurilla's. Historical records showed them leading explorations into space, surviving harsh environments where decorative scales would have shattered. "This is propaganda," Zixna shrieked, but her voice wavered. "These are your original records," Kurilla spoke, her voice strong. "The ones you tried to hide. Our ancestors weren't prized for their beauty. They were respected for their strength, their wisdom, their ability to protect our people." The younger Zixterans in the chamber began whispering among themselves, pointing at the images. Some even looked at Kurilla with new eyes. "I move to dismiss these false records," Zixna declared, but another council member stood up. "I recognize these," the elderly counselor said. "My grandmother spoke of them before the Great Rewriting. We changed our history to promote aesthetic perfection. We became obsessed with appearance over substance." Chaos erupted in the chamber. Younger Zixterans moved closer to Kurilla, asking questions about their true history. The council members looked at each other uncertainly, their perfect world crumbling around them. "The exile vote will proceed," Zixna shouted desperately. "I think," James said loudly, "any vote should wait until your people have had time to learn their true history, unless you're afraid of what they might discover." The challenge hung in the air. Kurilla stood tall, no longer an outcast, but a living link to their proud past. The revolution had begun, not with violence, but with truth. The week following the revelation transformed Zixtera. Young Zixterans began experimenting with their appearances, some even using temporary dyes to darken their scales in solidarity with Kurilla. The crystal streets buzzed with discussions about their true heritage. Kurilla walked through the marketplace, no longer hiding in shadows. A group of children ran up to her, their normally shimmering scales deliberately dulled with mineral paste. "Tell us about the warrior queens," they begged, looking at her with admiration instead of disgust. James watched from nearby, smiling as Kurilla sat with the children, sharing stories of their ancestors' bravery. The Earth diplomat had never seen her so animated, so free. "The change is remarkable," an elderly council member said, approaching James. "We forgot that true beauty comes in many forms. Our obsession with perfection nearly cost us our history." In the Grand Library, young scholars pored over newly unsealed records. The truth spread rapidly across social networks. The dark scales weren't a defect, but an evolutionary advantage. Their ancestors had used them to explore harsh worlds, survive extreme conditions, and build their civilization. "It's happening faster than we expected," Kurilla told James that evening as they walked through the palace gardens. "The younger generation, they're embracing change." "People were ready for truth," James replied. "They just needed someone brave enough to show it to them." High Counselor Zixna and her supporters still resisted, but their influence waned daily. More Zixterans began speaking out about feeling pressured to maintain perfect appearances at the cost of their health and happiness. A group of artists created a new mural in the city center, a striking blend of light and dark scales, showing the beauty in both. Kurilla stopped to admire it, tears in her eyes. "Your people are rediscovering themselves," James said softly, taking her hand. "Our people," she corrected him. "Earth's acceptance helped make this possible. You helped make this possible." As the three moons rose, casting their light over the crystal city, Kurilla and James stood together, watching young Zixterans celebrate their newfound freedom to be imperfect. The revolution wasn't just about appearance. It was about accepting themselves for who they truly were. The great crystal cathedral sparkled with both light and dark crystals, symbolizing Zixtera's new embrace of diversity. Today wasn't just a royal wedding. It was the celebration of a cultural renaissance. Kurilla stood before her mirror, her dark scales polished but proudly natural. Young Zixterans had woven earth flowers into her ceremonial dress, bridging two worlds just as her marriage to James would. "Are you ready?" asked her youngest sister, who had recently stopped using scale lightening treatments. "Everyone's waiting." The ceremony hall was packed with beings from both worlds. Earth diplomats sat beside Zixteran nobles, many of whom now sported their natural variations rather than forced perfection. Even some council members had begun letting their artificial enhancements fade. James waited at the altar, wearing a suit that incorporated both Earth formal wear and Six-Terran crystal patterns. His smile when he saw Kurilla could have lit up all 3 moons. Today, the elderly council member performing the ceremony announced, "We don't just unite 2 beings in marriage. We celebrate the union of our worlds and the return to our true heritage." Kurilla and James exchanged vows in both Earth and Six-Terran languages. Their promises spoke not just of love, but of understanding, acceptance, and seeing beauty in differences. In Earth tradition, James said, placing a ring on Kurilla's hand, "This circle represents endless love." In our oldest traditions, Kurilla replied, attaching a dark crystal to James's collar, "This represents the strength to protect and wisdom to lead." High Counselor Six washed from the back, her perfect features now showing signs of natural aging. The revolution had stripped her of power, but given her something more valuable: freedom from endless perfection. As Kurilla and James sealed their union with both a human kiss and a Six-Terran light-sharing ceremony, the cathedral erupted in cheers. Young Six-Terrans threw crystal petals that shimmered in all colors, from brightest shine to deepest black. "Did you ever imagine this?" James whispered to his new wife as they walked down the aisle. "Never," Kurilla replied, looking at her transformed world. "But then, I never imagined meeting someone who could see past appearances to the truth within." Their union marked the beginning of a new era. Six-Terra would never return to its obsession with perfect beauty. Instead, it embraced something far more precious: the beauty of being authentically oneself.